Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Big rumours as to what's really going on behind the scenes at Red Bull Racing, and Yuki Tsunoda. When he joined that team on the third round of the season, he would have expected a far better time alongside Max than he has had so far, and not only is he set to be leaving the team at the end of the season if this continues, but Pierre Gasly reveals there's a lot more to the story than initially meets the eye. He has some experience in that Red Bull second car and reveals that there are many things that Tsunoda has told him that he cannot reveal publicly that give serious reason as to what has been going on and exactly why we have seen that in reality. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. Let's start with the driver market because there's a few interesting developments. This is one of them. It's the Bottas-Perez debate that continues, and over the last month or so we have seen the swings and roundabouts of this at Cadillac. The prevailing theory is that Cadillac will sign one experienced driver and one more inexperienced driver, and the more experienced driver was, we think, going to be Sergio Perez. That was the number one candidate. Then there were rumours it was going to be Bottas instead. Then there were rumours it was actually Perez, and now the latest discussion is that it's actually going to be Bottas. I think Bottas has a great chance to get on the grid next year. If it's not Cadillac, I think Alpine will be a big consideration. That has been the recent talk, but who knows? If you're Bottas, which team would you choose? You'd probably choose Alpine, would you not? They've got the Mercedes engines and expected to be a pretty solid force. Cadillac are not really expected to challenge that much for certainly the first couple of years. They're going to have Ferrari engines until General Motors have their own engine online a couple of years down the line. That's the Cadillac story. Mick Schumacher has been linked there as one of the more inexperienced drivers. I saw this quote when he was effectively told that there's no reason for anyone to sign you. And guess who it is? Drum roll please, it's Jacques Villeneuve. He's done it again. Jacques Villeneuve basically said, you know, he's not that good, didn't have a great end to his time in F1, so there's no reason to sign him. Is Jacques Villeneuve wrong on this one compared to some other candidates they could consider? Maybe not, but it is a Villeneuve quote, so it is what it is. Now, there was also this from Toto Wolff. He was talking about the state of the driver market at Mercedes. We know that Max Verstappen has been a feature of the Mercedes discussions and says it's obviously not ideal that there's been chatter about Max. Of course, Toto not apologising for it, and nor should he, right? Because he's only done the right thing. In my opinion, as team principal of the team, he says, like, if I had a Christmas wish, it'd be less pressure on the drivers, but it just doesn't go away in Formula 1. And, of course, he has been a part of putting that on his drivers as well. Now, a big update came from this interview that the race did with this man, Stefano Domenicali, about the future of Formula 1. This is controversial for sure, and I'm sure you guys are going to have your opinions on it. So they talked about a lot of things, especially the calendar and also sprints. I mean, let's just, address the elephant in the room on what that looks like. So they sat down with Domenicali and they had a bit of a chatter. The big one, I think, to mention here is around the sprint weekends and what that looks like. For this year, there are 6 sprints. Next year, I think they're also planning to do 6 sprints of the 24 rounds. But in time, they are considering upping that number. Would I be in favour of eliminating all sprints? If I was watching every Grand Prix from home, I think I would probably say yes. I do appreciate that in person, having another race on the Saturday and therefore qualifying Friday does make it a more compelling weekend to attend. I get that argument. I think the sprints lately haven't been terrible, although the one in Spa was horrific. But, it is what it is, apart from literally the first couple of corners. The question really becomes, next year, the performance differential of the cars is likely to be more substantial. So the sprint will, even more so than it has previously been, probably just be a preview of the race, and you will just see the car performance very much exemplified, and kind of like how the sprints used to be in 2023. Leclerc would stick it on pole in Baku for the sprint, and you would know within the first few laps that he had no chance of holding back the Red Bulls, and they overtook him in the sprint, and then the same thing happened again in the Grand Prix, to absolutely nobody's surprise. So it ruined all of the tension around the race for Sunday, and the sprints have generally done that, I would say. The sprint format, I think, has improved to some degree with having a sprint qualifying, then the sprint, then qualifying on the Saturday afternoon, which enables Parc Fermé to be reopened. The teams can make changes. That, I think, has been a reasonable adjustment. But there has been talk, would you believe, about bringing reverse grids onto the calendar. Now, some have suggested this. It happened in F3, it happened in F2. Just to quickly clarify, in F2, they do a qualifying session. The sprint race order is determined by the exact order of the qualifying, but you swap the top 10. So whoever qualifies first starts 10th on the grid. Whoever qualifies 10th starts first on the grid for the sprint, and then they go back to normal for the main race. So it gives you that little spicy element of switching up the grid and putting the theoretical faster driver in 10th place. And it's difficult to make progress there because the cars in F2 are equal, mostly, apart from the engines, as we know, can be questionable at times. Shout out Dirkson's car last year, if you guys remember that at Monza, another Grand Prix too. But that's the idea. Now, the only reason why that works, of course, is because there's only one qualifying session. So you're incentivized to still qualify first, because for the main race, you're still going to be first if you stick it on pole. It's just you've got to start the sprint from 10th. So it's been done like that for some time, and it works in F2, I would say. Should it work in F1? I mean, I don't really like the idea of reverse grids in general. I think they pros and problems, and I don't like it from, let's say, a hardcore motorsport fan perspective, but I can see why they might want to experiment with it. I wouldn't be surprised if Domoneycali and the guys at Formula Management do experiment with things like this over the coming years. I'm not sure that's going to be a good idea, but his opinion is that, look, if you don't play around with ideas, you're not going to find good ones. And I kind of get that. He does say that we're not going to go to 24 sprints, but we have to do steps in the middle. So, you know, this is what they always say, isn't it, right? Domoneycali said this before, that, oh, well, no, we think 6 sprint is a pretty good number. And now his opinion is, well, you know, we're not going to do 24, but we're probably not going to do 6, and we're probably going to look to do maybe 8 or 10, right, in 2027. So here we go, baby. Welcome to Formula 1 going forwards. We're racing under a motorway in Miami around an autodrome, and we're doing sprints, you know, potentially every weekend. So it is what it is. I think it's going to be good for some and bad for others, and that's the discussion as of late on the future of F1. Quickly on 2026, there's been lots of talk about what it means for overtaking. As I say, I'm expecting the performance differentials next year to be far more substantial than they presently are. It would be a huge surprise if they weren't. The cars, according to James Vowles, are actually very challenging to drive. Not from a purely driving perspective, but in terms of the execution of the battery deployment, the high downforce and the low downforce versions of the active aerodynamics. And Val says that there's so much more for the drivers to consider, that the workload is very challenging on the drivers. But also it means that some drivers will just straight up be better at managing their energy, deploying it where necessary, because with 50% of the engine being electrical, that constitutes a far more important and integral part of your power deployment. So if you're managing it better as a driver, it could potentially mean that you can make overtakes happen even more frequently if you're managing that better than, you know, other drivers are on the grid. And that exists to some degree now, energy management, battery deployment, stuff like this, but it's nowhere near as integral as it will be next time around in 2026. So the drivers aren't really happy about that, but once they get some reps under their belt, it's something they will learn, and, you know, it's probably a bit of a skill gap in terms of, you know, what the famous question about the monkey in the cockpit. It's not going to be the same in 26. There's going to be a lot for these guys to think about. But let's talk about Red Bull Racing and what's been happening there over the last several years, frankly, and continues to be the case with Yuki Tsunoda. Danny Rick was on a podcast and he was asked, if you remove your driver hat, you put on your fan hat, who's, you know, you're the biggest fan of? And he says, for many reasons, for different reasons, it is Max Verstappen. Now, Ricciardo knows what it's like to be alongside Max at Red Bull Racing. It was a challenge for him at the time, but we know that Ricciardo was the most recent teammate who actually did anything against Max Verstappen in terms of being relatively competitive. And Yuki Tsunoda, despite being a real talent in the junior series and over his several years in F1, has, I think, only improved and became, you know, a real force, a real driver that people looked at every weekend with optimism that for AlphaTauri he could deliver a result, and on many occasions he did. He comes into Red Bull. He had a difficult Japanese Grand Prix, and since then, it's been an absolute shambles, right? Like, if we go back to Monaco, 17th place, 13th in Spain, 12th in Canada, 16th in Austria, 15th in Silverstone, 13th in Spa, although it could have been better with strategy, Red Bull messed it up, and then 17th in Hungary again. But, Max was only 9th, finishing behind Liam Lawson in a Racing Bull. So it's happened again. Is anyone shocked? Clearly a solid driver. Look, is Yuki great? Was he ever going to be World Championship material? Look, I'm a big fan of Yuki's. I think he's a really likable driver, and I'm one of many that really wish Yuki the best. But, I'm not going to overstate that I never thought Yuki was like that guy exactly, but I definitely thought that he was a solid driver and definitely improved over the last few years. And you would have expected better than what's happened here. Now, we know that Imola was a big challenge for him because he had a big crash there. That damaged his car, and it meant that by the time that they fixed it, he's not had the upgrades, right? It's been the case now for several rounds that he's not had quite the car that Max has had. And they've brought plenty of upgrades, Red Bull. They've brought plenty of tweaks. Not all of them seemingly have worked, but they've added performance here and there, and Yuki has not got those as swiftly as Max has. It's not really helped Max much in the grand scheme of things. It's definitely given him some more performance. In Silverstone, it was pretty clear that the new floor that they brought, that I think just Max had at the time, was beneficial for their downforce in the high speed anyway, and was able to help Max get pole position there ahead of the McLarens. But as Yuki said, it's like, look, judge me when I've got the same car rather than when I haven't. And when we saw that in Hungary, when he pretty much had all the upgrades on the car, he was within a tenth and a half of Max in qualifying in Q1. Unfortunately, it was only Q1, which was the closest that anyone had been to Max around Budapest since Danny Rick in 2017. But he was still out in Q1 because the field spread is so tight and the car is just not very quick. And then, of course, in Hungary, you start near the back of the grid. Good luck on Sunday, right? And we saw that with many a driver. So will Yuki stay next year? Our current understanding is no, right? That the current rumour is that Hadjar is potentially going to replace him. That's what Red Bull Racing are looking to do. Now, does that change with McKees coming into the team instead of Christian Horner? We know that McKees' good relationship with Yuki over at Racing Bulls, but also good relationship with Isaac Hadjar as well. And if Tsunoda doesn't deliver points, then it's very difficult to justify keeping him. Now, he's got 10 more rounds, Yuki, to turn it around. We've seen some promise over the last couple of weekends. Spa was actually pretty good. The team screwed him over in the race. And then Hungary was actually, acceptably fast. But unfortunately, just in a horrible position. And his race pace has been pretty horrific, to be honest. But it's not like he was expected to do much from where he was in Budapest anyway. But the big rumour is that Tsunoda will not be staying around. His contract is expiring. There's maybe options with Cadillac. There's maybe options with Alpine. But the Honda partnership coming to a close, he's not going to get that support anymore. There's a real feeling that Yuki might end up joining Aston in like a reserve driver role, or he might go and drive in something else. But the general theory is that as it stands, Yuki is not going to be staying in that Red Bull team next year. They will simply promote Hadjar. They will likely keep Lawson at Racing Bulls, and they will bring in Arvid Lindblad. That is the most likely of the current outcomes. But again, it would constitute yet another iteration of that Red Bull second seat, would just simply fail to deliver. And it would be especially harsh on Yuki because at least when, Perez was underperforming, right? He had a difficult end to 2023 and, of course, pretty much the whole of 2024. But at least at a decent chunk of that season, he at least had a car that was capable of either winning or getting podiums or at least scoring regular points and helping out the team. Whereas the percentage of points scored for Max versus Yuki is just, growing away every single weekend. But it's not like Max is winning races and finishing on the podiums. Max hasn't scored a podium in the last 4 Grand Prix weekends, which is very, very rare for him in his career. But Yuki can't even score a point in that car right now. And even when it looks like he can or could, then things go wrong in the race like in Spa. So Gasly said something very fascinating. And maybe, some would say, he shouldn't have said anything at all because he's kind of speaking very cryptically and it's not clear what he exactly means. But of course, we are here to speculate. So Gasly was in that team, had the second seat situation early in his career and was one of the drivers chewed up and spit out by the Red Bull machine and Max Verstappen. But since then, Yuki and Gasly, they got along very well when they were teaming together at AlphaTauri, and since then Gasly is highly regarded, I think, by the F1 community with what he has recently achieved at Alpine. But this is what he has to say. What's tricky is my time. A lot of things cannot be said because you're a driver, you're working for a team, and as a professional, you cannot share all the information on specific situations. Talking with Yuki, I know some stuff that cannot be said, and it's not easy. It's not easy to be in this situation. You try and do what's best for the team, and sometimes you get given something to make it work, and sometimes you're in a situation where, for different reasons, it can't quite work the way that you like. All he can do is support Tsunoda as a friend. I just chat to my friend and advise him stuff that might help him. I think ultimately it's up to him and the team to make it work and do the right things for it to work. And that also is kind of an interesting final sentence because, look, Gasly is heavily implying here that Yuki is, let's say, being forced into certain situations that don't necessarily favour him. And it's understandable, maybe. Max is getting the backing of Red Bull. They're trying to give Max every chance to win the drivers. They're not going to win the constructors anyway. And as a result, Yuki is likely going out in setups in practice where they're testing out things to see if they're going to work for Max. He's doing X, he's doing Y, he's trying this, he's trying that on the car, not necessarily because it's going to benefit him, but because the team's only goal was, maybe still is, but realistically it's kind of over now, isn't it? Max winning the drivers, so the constructors was less of a concern. But what does he mean exactly, right? He's saying, and Hamilton has implied this as well at Ferrari, he said that there's things that have happened that he wants to share that he can't talk about going on behind the scenes. And Gasly says that when he was a driver there, it's a similar story. And now he's been talking to Yuki and knows that there are things happening. Like, the implication is there are things happening, there are decisions being made behind the scenes at Red Bull that are inhibiting Yuki Tsunoda's ability to perform at his very top level. And, there's no real other way to read that. Exactly what those things are and what extent this comes to, right, is that, the team rigging it against Yuki? I don't think so, right? I think what's more likely is, as I say, they've tried to pull out all the stops to help Max, and that's compromising Yuki's performance, at least in some regard. You can say, the car's designed this way, the car's designed that way, whatever. But there's clearly elements where, and this also comes down to upgrades that the team has got, maybe what they've got Yuki working on in his car, whatever. Like, there's a few elements probably that have inhibited Yuki's performance. And, the thing is, a tenth of a second is, that's a blink of an eye over the course of a lap, right? And if you make some changes that cost Yuki a couple of tenths on where he would be, and all of a sudden the actual field spread between the cars is very slim and the Red Bull isn't very good this year, then all of a sudden you're kind of condemning Yuki to Q1, Q2 exits almost every single time and putting him in a very difficult position. And of course, because he's having less qualifying sessions, gets less chance to really get to grips with the car and improve it and, really enjoy the car on low fuel, if it's even possible to say that for the RB21. But that's what Gasly has to say. Now, Verstappen was kind of asked the question too, is the car built for you? And he says, look, that's not really the case. I just try my best to adapt to it. And look, if the car was built for Max, you would argue maybe it would be far faster this year than it actually is. But that's the latest rumour, right? That Yuki not only is going to be leaving at the end of the season, it's very unlikely for him to stay, but also there are some decisions being made that are interesting to say the very least. And Gasly's been kind of cryptic with his assessment that, there are problems at Red Bull and things specifically that are hurting Yuki Tsunoda with respect to Max Verstappen and potentially causing the early ends to his career earlier in F1 than maybe should be the case given Yuki's clear talent. But it definitely implies something, right? Like, you can't look, as whatever you think about Yuki, whether you think he's any good or not, whatever, if you look at the drivers that they've had in that second seat over the last several years and the way that it's ended for all of them, it's difficult to argue that it's just about Max being an absolute force of nature, which he is. But when you see the amount of drivers that have been chewed up and spat out, there's clearly more to it than that in terms of the way that Red Bull approaches things and just their general culture or, the way that second seat setup is designed. And look, Laurent Marquis, I imagine, is starting to realise these things or know some of these things that were there under the Horner era that he would probably like to change. But will he be able to? Is there anything to that end that he will be able to do to help out his boy in Yuki? I'm not so sure, but intrigued your perspective in the comments below. Just one final thing. I don't know what you guys think about this. Some would say this is sensible management. Others would say this is, how to say it exactly, woke nonsense, right? Utter woke nonsense. Because often you look back in F1 history, you look at rivalries in recent decades, like Alonso-Hamilton, like Rosberg-Hamilton, right? Like fierce intra-team rivalries that boiled over a lot. Now, McLaren are trying to avoid that. Their drivers, I think, naturally, certainly Norris, also Piastri to some degree, are naturally less kind of inclined to those type of rivalries. But equally, it's still pretty spicy. So Norris and Piastri have been asked by the team, at least they will be in due course. Zach Brown said, one of them's going to win, one of them's going to lose. And when that happens, they are going to respond to it in the wishes of the losing driver. So what I mean by that is, they're going to speak to the drivers and say, okay, one of you's going to win, one of you's going to lose. When one of you wins and loses, how do you want us to celebrate? Would you prefer we celebrate with the team? You know, we congratulate Piastri, Norris, whoever's the winner, whoever's the loser, in the way that we would a champion. Would you prefer that we don't do it in front of you? Would you prefer that we book you a private jet home straight away so you don't have to experience it? Like, I get the logic behind doing this. It just feels a little bit like, I don't know, is it a bit like nannying the drivers or something, right? Like, I want to see fierce rivalries, and I get why McLaren don't want that, right? But the idea of going to their drivers and saying, well, you know, we don't want you to feel upset when you lose the championship, so let's just make, you know, we'll work around that. It's like, I get it, I guess, and maybe it is sensible management, but no other team is moving like McLaren nowadays, right? Like, do you not feel like McLaren, the way that they work with their papaya rules and they're asking the drivers what they want to do when the other guy wins? It's just not like, it's not cold-blooded, you know? And I think that McLaren over the last couple of years have had such a great car, and obviously very solid drivers as well, that they've been able to reap the rewards of what they've built and the car that they have. But there's still certain elements of that McLaren program where I'm like, is that really that championship mentality that is going to keep you at the top of the sport? Maybe, right? We'll see how time progresses. But some teams have that real killer instinct, and some drivers do, and some teams and drivers do not. And I don't know if this is something to consider there, but I think it's been a controversial one. I've seen lots of opinions on both sides of this, but very much interested in your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.